Prepare to challenge everything you thought you knew about the Mexican drug cartels. Forget the sensationalized headlines and binge-worthy Netflix series. Today, we're plunging into the tumultuous 1980s, a pivotal era when obscure smugglers mutated into billionaire kingpins whose names would echo across the globe. We'll unveil the shocking truth of how Félix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, and Don Neto engineered Mexico's most formidable criminal empire, the Guadalajara Cartel, and how they audaciously defied American intelligence services, bending every rule imaginable. This isn't merely a tale of crime. It's a gripping chronicle of intrigue, deep-seated corruption, and a brutal power struggle that continues to reverberate worldwide even today. Leave superficial facts behind. We're exposing what really transpired behind the scenes. In today's world, it's highly improbable that anyone hasn't heard of Mexican drug cartels. Their ruthless conflicts regularly dominate global news, and streaming platforms frequently adapt their stories into dramatic series. Our focus today will be on the very period that so often captivates filmmakers, the transformative years when Mexican criminal groups transitioned from scattered smuggling gangs into multi-billion-dollar empires. It was then that they began appearing on Forbes's lists, acquiring the most extravagant private jets and amassing luxury properties across the globe. We will journey back to 1980 to trace how Félix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, Don Neto, and their associates forged the largest alliance of Mexican drug traffickers. We will examine how the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, confronted this burgeoning phenomenon, battling not only criminals, but also bureaucratic hurdles within both the American and Mexican governments. And, as always, our aim is to present you with facts that delve far beneath the surface. The commonly accepted name Guadalajara Cartel is, in reality, not entirely precise. This organization wasn't a cartel in the strict economic sense, and the name Guadalajara was not their self-designation. Economically speaking, a cartel is defined as an agreement among businesses to control a market and set prices. In the context of Colombian and Mexican narco-trafficking, this term gained traction in the 1970s. Such a designation, while not entirely accurate, was primarily convenient for legal prosecution. It is significantly simpler to pursue a unified organization, like the Medellin or Guadalajara cartels, rather than relentlessly chase fragmented gangs. The renowned criminal attorney Gustavo Salazar astutely observed, "Cartels don't exist. There are just groups of drug traffickers. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't." American prosecutors simply labeled them cartels to simplify case management. In truth, Mexican criminal organizations were in constant flux, their alliances frequently forming and dissolving. Nevertheless, it was precisely in the 1980s that a certain system began to emerge on this fragmented map, a system we will discuss today. The name cartel was coined for convenience by DEA agents at a time when they didn't even suspect the true scale and magnitude of Gallardo and his associates' operations. Only later would the entire world come to know Sinaloa, Culiacan, and Michoacan. In the 1980s, DEA agents naively described the group as the Guadalajara one, although arguably it would have been more accurate to consider it a continuation of the Sinaloa cartel, which, due to specific circumstances, had relocated to Guadalajara. We will now examine these circumstances. Between 1976 and 1977, the American and Mexican governments conducted an extensive anti-drug operation dubbed Condor, which, in their view, concluded successfully. The essence of the operation was that the United States provided Mexican law enforcement with agents and equipment for the physical destruction of marijuana and opium poppy plantations, as well as assistance in arresting drug traffickers. Officially, the destruction of 22,000 acres of poppy, sufficient to produce 8 tons of heroin, was reported. These declarations of victory were bolstered by objective evidence. The purity of Mexican heroin sold at retail in the United States reached its lowest level in 7 years. But this, of course, was only on paper. The operation itself compelled the key leaders of Sinaloa, then Mexico's largest narco organization, to abandon their strongholds and relocate to Guadalajara. The leader's decision can be viewed from two perspectives. On one hand, the reduction of plantations and military intervention effectively forced them to move to a location beyond the reach of the United States, and Guadalajara was perfect for hiding. On the other hand, their relocation particularly underscores the powerful ties between drug traffickers and politicians and the DFS, the Mexican equivalent of the FBI. According to a Mexican DEA informant and former DFS employee, the idea of moving south was suggested to the Sinaloa leaders, Félix Gallardo and Don Neto, by two high-ranking DFS commanders, Esteban Guzman and Daniel Acuña, during a private meeting. The informant claimed that the federal agents interested in the success of their common cause personally introduced the Sinaloa contingent to influential individuals in Guadalajara, found them comfortable homes, and provided bodyguards. Drug traffickers brought money and power, wrote Sherry Finkelstein in her book Desperados, and the DFS provided intelligence, coordination, and protection from other government agencies. The Sinaloans at the time were not the only players in the burgeoning illegal drug market, but they were unquestionably the most important and promising organization. They controlled the largest production areas for marijuana and opium poppy from Oaxaca to Sonora, extending through Guerrero and Michoacán, plus two production strongholds in Durango and Chihuahua. They also managed the main border crossings in the states of Baja California, Tijuana, Tecate, and Mexicali, and Sonora, San Luis Rio Colorado, and Nogales, profiting from an arrangement with Pablo Acosta's organization in Ojinaga, Chihuahua. Guadalajara became an ideal haven for drug traffickers. As soon as Operation Condor ceased, they began organizing drug operations on a scale larger than ever before. To maximize profits, they did what all shrewd businessmen do. They opted for economies of scale. Instead of purchasing marijuana from small family-run farms in the Sierra Madre, they built colossal plantations, so immense that they were visible for miles from the sky. Such plantations required hundreds, if not thousands, of personnel. These colossal volumes of marijuana translated into colossal money and an incredible reach in drug trafficking. As we can see, the most adaptable narco-entrepreneurs not only survived during Condor, but thrived due to complex and well-oiled mechanisms. These mechanisms included numerous links, from immense plantations in the Golden Triangle, the states of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua, to a system of cash payments to all major politicians and ministerial chiefs. This system had evolved over decades, beginning in the 1920s, and by the early 1980s, it represented a unified organism where everyone was connected vertically and horizontally. We discussed this formation in more detail in the first part of the history of the birth of Mexican drug cartels. Among all the drug traffickers of the late 1970s, Pedro Avilés Pérez, Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo, Rafael Caro Quintero, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, and several other important figures particularly stood out, whom we will now discuss in more detail, as they ultimately influenced the current situation. So it all began in the late 1960s, when on the Sinaloa scene, where smuggling gangs fiercely vied for territory, the first leading figure, named Pedro Avilés Pérez, appeared. Born in 1940, he was involved in his family's illegal dealings from childhood. Once in power, he dedicated himself to smuggling heroin into Southern California and Arizona. Later, Avilés pivoted to the light drug market with the advent of its popularity, transporting marijuana in 10-ton shipments. He introduced innovations such as air transport and the bribery of high-ranking officials, significantly ahead of his time. He established contacts in South America and took delivery of small consignments of cocaine, which, however, were not his primary source of income. Avilés' network stretched from Culiacán to Mexicali and Tijuana. Many Sinaloa drug traffickers who became influential figures in the 1980s learned the trade from Avilés. Notably, Rafael Caro Quintero, at the age of 16, joined him and rose to the rank of a boss within the gang in Chihuahua. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, better known as Don Neto, served as Aviles' treasurer, managing the network's money and investments. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the future boss of bosses, at the start of his criminal career, was simply a corrupt police officer on Aviles' payroll, and his duties included extortion and bribery. Parallel to Aviles, another important character in our story was building his career. Alberto the Sicilian Falcone, also known as the Falcon or the Sicilian Falcon. A brilliant, life-loving Cuban who started as a street thug in Miami, he made his way from Miami to Mexico City, where he charmed a wealthy and influential woman. This high society lady took Alberto under her wing, dressed him like a playboy, taught him the rules of etiquette, and introduced him to the right people. He later purchased a horse ranch and frequented the elite from Acapulco to Madrid. The Sicilian Falcon organized the first major overland cocaine transport from South America through Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Tijuana to Los Angeles in late 1973. By 1978, agents had arrested approximately 400 people linked to Falcone's American distribution network. Alberto Falcone was arrested by Mexican police in July 1975, becoming the last major drug trafficker to be incarcerated in Mexico for a long period until 1985. But the fact was, he wasn't Mexican. He was Cuban, and moreover, a notorious sexual pervert. The Drug Enforcement Administration, leveraging these facts, literally persuaded the Mexicans to arrest him. Once behind bars, Alberto continued to manage his organization from his cell, and in 1978, 20 years before the legendary El Chapo, he orchestrated a similar escape through an excavated tunnel but was quickly caught and sentenced to another 20 years. He was released in 1999 after serving 24 years. Another important drug trafficker who worked with the Sicilian and was based in Guadalajara was Manuel Salcedo Uzeda, nicknamed El Cachaloc, meaning the crazy pig, due to his cruelty and quick temper. The Sicilian couldn't manage things remotely for long. A new leader was emerging in Culiacan, and Cachaloc soon joined him. This leader, as you now know, was named Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. He was described as shrewd, reserved, refined, and ruthless, qualities that made him Sinaloa's most influential boss. He was born in 1946 in the small town of Bella Vista, Culiacan Municipality, Sinaloa State, into a farming family. His family was not involved in drug trafficking, unlike the Caro Quintero and Fonseca Carrillo families, as we will discuss later. Gallardo's parents worked on the local ejido, a system of communal land plots, which we mentioned in the previous episode. As a child, Miguel sold chicken and sausages, cycling around the neighborhood. He never engaged in heavy physical labor. His sister, interviewed in 1989, stated, "We are from a respectable, well-educated family. We are not peasants in sandals. My mother had 11 children and worked the land to help us in life." Miguel Ángel easily completed middle school and then enrolled in a local business college. Without finishing it, he worked for a time as a camelo, mule, and at the age of 17 in 1963, he became an officer of the Mexican National Police, where he began to get involved in the drug trade, receiving small sums of money from the boss of the era, Pedro Aviles. In the late 1960s, with Aviles's active support, Miguel Ángel found employment as a bodyguard for the governor of Sinaloa from the Institutional Revolutionary Party, Leopoldo Sánchez Celis. Despite not possessing exceptional physical attributes, at nearly 190 centimeters tall, he weighed only about 70 kilograms, which earned him the nickname the Thin One. It is known that the first arrest warrant for Gallardo for drug possession dates back to 1971, and according to police, the case ultimately led nowhere. And naturally, he was not dismissed from his bodyguard position. Miguel became so close to the governor that he even served as godfather to one of his sons named Rodolfo. In addition to Sanchez Celis, Miguel Angel's circle of friends included Antonio Toledo Coro, who succeeded Celis as governor in 1975. When Aviles Perez was killed in a shootout with federal police in 1978, Félix Gallardo took over the reins of the organization along with Aviles' former treasurer, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, nicknamed Don Neto, and his childhood friend, one of Aviles's lieutenants, Rafael Caro Quintero. As omnipresent DEA informants claim, it was Don Neto who allegedly commissioned the federal agents to kill Avilés, but these are mostly rumors. Don Neto was 47 years old at the time and was a respected veteran and a kind of aristocrat of second-generation narco-trafficking. He was born in Badiraguado in the early 1930s and was the son of one of the first opium sales intermediaries, but he was drawn into this business by his maternal uncle, Fidel Carrillo. The young Don Neto's mentor was arrested in Tijuana in 1955 during a police operation. His uncle was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and Neto escaped with a scare and learned a lifelong lesson. Always pay the police. In the early 1970s, he delved into cocaine smuggling from Ecuador through Mexico to the United States, and it was then that he received the nickname Mr. Good Price for his negotiating prowess. Under Avilés, Fonseca Carrillo was one of the older hands in the business. Notably, sources report his arrest in Ecuador in 1973 while attempting to transport 30 kilograms of cocaine, and it was very likely not the only shipment, as Avilés' gang was also at the forefront in this regard. Miguel Angel only had to follow the already established path and expand the business, listening to the advice of his older companion. Don Neto had 4 children, but none of them are known within the Guadalajara Cartel. However, his nephew Amado Carrillo Fuentes, also known as the Lord of the Skies, a nickname he earned for the air transport method invented by his uncle, is well known. Soon after, Amado would become the head of a very important territory for efficient cargo transport known as Juarez, and would receive another nickname, the Vice President. Another of Guadalajara's leaders was Rafael Caro Quintero. If Don Neto was a second-generation narco-aristocrat, Caro Quintero was a Sinaloan narco-peasant. He was born in Sinaloa, according to some sources, between 1952 and 1956. He had more connections than Fonseca Carrillo, as his family had long been involved in opium poppy cultivation and heroin production. His maternal uncle, Lamberto Quintero, was a well-known drug trafficker in the 1970s, and his brothers Miguel and Hector were also in the business. But by the time of Rafa's childhood, being a narco dealer did not yet mean being fabulously wealthy, and so he, the eldest of 12 children, only completed a couple of grades and was forced to go to work. As a teenager, he ended up in Avilés' gang, where he quickly rose through the ranks. Caro Quintero's specialty was cannabis. In 1971, he was arrested while transporting marijuana to Avilés' warehouses in San Luis Rio, Colorado. After being released from prison, he moved to the town of Cabor on the Sonora coast, where he purchased over 80 hectares of land and experimented with marijuana strains. It would be Rafa and his brothers who would become the king of Sinsemilla, which in the early 1980s would begin to bring in enormous profits. Sinsemilla, whose name translates as without seeds, is a method of cultivating 2-meter-tall female plants in whose tops the maximum concentration of THC is found. It is an expensive and complex agricultural process for which the Guadalajara Cartel had the resources and capabilities, and Rafael Caro Quintero was a true professor in the cultivation of Sinsemilla. The story of the Guadalajara Cartel would be incomplete without mentioning the legendary boss Joaquin Guzman Loera, better known as El Chapo. Although his name would become famous later in the 1990s, we will still discuss him, as at least in the series Narcos Mexico, a completely nonsensical version of his appearance in Guadalajara is shown. And now you will understand why. Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera was born in a tiny village near La Tuna on April 4, 1957. Chapo's entire family was employed in opium poppy cultivation and earned good money for the kilograms of harvest. As you may recall from the previous video, it was very problematic for a common farmer to sell what he had grown. But if this farmer, like El Chapo's father, was a distant relative of Pedro Avilés Perez, then there were no problems. Thus, at the age of 20, Chapo was already knowledgeable in commercial matters and had earned a reputation as an indispensable person in cases where delicate problems needed to be resolved. In a few years of hard work, he transformed from a poor relative of Avilés into one of Gallardo's intimates, and, just as Gallardo once did with Avilés, now Chapo with Gallardo, learned all the business management skills and, it must be said, achieved considerable success. But we will discuss this in more detail in a future video about El Chapo himself. In addition to the aforementioned individuals, the Sinaloa organization included other people with prominent names: Ismael El Mayo Zambada, Arturo Beltran Leyva, and the Arellano Felix brothers. On the Ojinaga border, the legendary Pablo Acosta reigned. Furthermore, other leaders included Hector El Güero, Palma Salazar, Juan José Esparragosa, El Azul, Jaime Herrera, the brothers Pedro and Oscar Lupercio Cerrato, Rafaela, Alba Alvarez, and the Diaz Parada family. All these people and their families were responsible for strategically important locations in the business and were loyal to the Sinaloans. As you may recall from the first video, family ties ensured the necessary level of trust for the operation of illegal markets, as they significantly reduced the possibility of betrayal. For example, Arturo Beltran was married to Chapo Guzman's cousin. It was thanks to trust that in the early 1980s, the Mexicans managed to create such a powerful drug distribution network. But, as we mentioned earlier, the leaders of the organization had to move to Guadalajara in 1978 when government troops arrived in Sinaloa. In a sense, Operation Condor did the Sinaloans a great service by eliminating competitors. The Americans' objective in this operation was the reduction of opium poppy cultivation, and shortly thereafter, attention shifted to marijuana. Initially, fields were sprayed with a pesticide that did not affect cannabis plants, but destroyed poppy. The share of Mexican diluted resin, as Mexican heroin was called, dropped to 30%, and the market was flooded by a stream of pure white merchandise from Afghanistan, which had enjoyed a good harvest year. Then the Americans proceeded to destroy marijuana. For this, a poison called paraquat was used, which led to unexpected consequences. Farmers continued to harvest the poisoned crops, dry them, and ship them to the insatiable northern neighbors. According to the most conservative estimates, 1/5 of all supplied Mexican cannabis was poisoned by this highly toxic substance, leading consumers to death. Congress decided to halt the fumigation, and drug addicts turned to Colombian suppliers. And here, we must briefly turn our attention away from Mexican affairs to understand some very important facts about Colombia, because what happened there directly influenced the events described. Firstly, by 1978, almost 1/4 of the American market consisted of marijuana imported from Colombia. Marijuana cultivation had spread inland and was generating $1 billion a year. The country was in political chaos after 20 years of massacres between political factions, which allowed drug traffickers to create their own distribution networks. In October 1978, the new president of Colombia, Julio César Turbay Ayala, declared that the narco economy represents a threat to the national security of the state, and until March 1980, he tried to combat it, but without success. Meanwhile, while all forces were concentrated on fighting the cultivation and transport of marijuana, which was already going out of fashion, in the still unknown city of Medellin, a new and powerful organization was being created with the aim of cocaine trafficking. And this is the second important fact. In the early 1970s, Cuban traffickers in Miami controlled a relatively small wholesale cocaine market in the United States. Their clients were primarily other Cuban émigrés. That was until the Colombians entered the business and unleashed what would go down in history as the Cocaine Cowboy Wars. The new Colombian dealers had a major advantage over the Cubans. Thanks to marijuana, the Medellin gangs had access to a vast network of middle-class distributors all along the east coast of the United States. Later, Drug Enforcement Administration agents concluded that the temporary destruction of the Mexican marijuana industry due to Operation Condor was the direct cause of the rise of the Colombian cocaine industry. While American agencies engaged in bureaucratic battles over how to stop the bloodshed on the streets of Miami, Medellin's cocaine trafficking networks grew to such an extent that the cocaine cowboys seemed like mere children. By 1982, DEA agents learned that Medellin's drug traffickers had formed a cartel and that 4 individuals were behind it: Jorge Ochoa, Pablo Escobar, Carlos Later, and Jose Rodriguez Gacha. At that time, they controlled 80% of the cocaine produced in Colombia. The Medellin cocaine cartel was the richest and most dangerous criminal group in the world and would continue to grow vertically and horizontally. But on June 24, 1982, President Reagan somewhat defeated bureaucracy and ordered the resumption of the war on drugs. Hundreds of FBI and DEA agents poured into Florida, the main point of sale for Colombian merchandise, and the so-called Caribbean route for drug transport, which was Medellin's primary route, began to collapse. But, as we know, according to the balloon effect, the air inside will shift to another part if compressed harder in one. And it was precisely at that moment, when the Colombians felt the pressure from the United States and the percentage of seizures increased, that they began searching for new routes to deliver cocaine to North America. And one doesn't need to be well versed in geography to understand. The most obvious route passed through Central America and Mexico. Compared to the Mexicans, when it came to cargo transport, the Colombians were perhaps novices. The only remaining issue was to establish contacts and strike a mutually beneficial agreement between the drug entrepreneurs of both countries. The key figure here was Juan Manuel Mata Ballesteros, a Honduran born in Tegucigalpa in 1945, who would become the largest employer in his country and one of the main protagonists of the golden age of cocaine. In 1961, at the age of 16, Mata emigrated to New York in search of the American dream, where he worked as a supermarket cashier. He subsequently married a Colombian and then ended up in prison, which, as usual, became a place to acquire useful contacts. Eventually, he escaped from there and began working with cocaine. One of his contacts for drug distribution was our old acquaintance Alberto the Sicilian Falcone, who was precisely beginning to supply Colombian cocaine. After establishing the trade networks, Ballesteros decided it was safer to operate from Honduras, and he moved to his hometown. It was there that the Colombians of the Medellin cartel sought him out, asking for his help with transport through Mexico. For Mata Ballesteros, who personally knew Rafael Caro Quintero and Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo, this was not difficult. Moreover, this intermediation was an opportunity to expand his business, as he became not only a member of the Medellin cartel, but also a member of the Guadalajara Cartel. And this is where, in reality, our story truly begins. Having established contacts with Caro Quintero and Félix Gallardo through Ballesteros, the Colombians began negotiations. According to DEA Regional Director Jay Bergman, the situation unfolded approximately as follows. The battle-hardened Colombians presented themselves to the Mexicans and declared, "We Colombians own the merchandise and can distribute it ourselves in the United States. You Mexicans only have marijuana and heroin. We propose a deal. We deliver our merchandise to your territory, you transport it across the border and deliver it to our men." From the perspective of the nascent Guadalajara cartel, it would have been foolish not to accept. Thus began the business relationship between the two largest criminal groups of their time. The outcome of this agreement was radical changes in the composition, structure, and profitability of Mexican organized crime. As you may recall from the first video, Mexican drug trafficking went through several phases, linked to the boom in substance consumption in the United States. The first was the demand for opium during the Second World War and in the 1950s. Then came the marijuana boom in the 1960s and 70s, and the third surge began precisely in the 1980s with the arrival of cocaine. In just a few years in the early 1980s, approximately by 1984, cocaine became the primary source of income for Mexican drug entrepreneurs. Direct participation in this new market was the solution to all their problems, as revenues from marijuana export were declining, and heroin export, while stable, did not generate large profits, given that its popularity had waned. In this way, transforming into a package delivery service for Colombian cartels to serve 6 million cocaine addicts in the United States, not only compensated for the decrease in revenues, but made the business more profitable. With growing profits came increased influence in all spheres. Criminals complicated their organizational structure in various ways, including the emergence of paramilitary formations to protect business interests, as well as the bribery of high-level officials. After all, transporting enormous volumes of cocaine required ever greater state protection and the involvement of all levels of power, from local police officers to deputies. The state and drug trafficking worked as a single mechanism whose gears were lubricated with the finest oil, millions of cocaine dollars. A special agent of the DEA who interviewed Pablo Acosta recounted a very eloquent episode related to the integration processes of Mexicans into the cocaine system. Ojinaga, in the state of Chihuahua, was an important border crossing point for transport, where the undisputed leader was Pablo Acosta, loyal to the Sinaloans. When the Colombians contacted the Guadalajara leaders, Don Neto, an old acquaintance of Acosta, sent his nephew, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, to Ojinaga as a guarantor of the purity of the agreement. Already by late 1984, the first direct flights from Colombia to Ojinaga on long-range twin-turboprop aircraft were recorded. Acosta's tasks included protecting the goods through his connections with the military, ensuring authorities did not seize them, and aiding in transport. A small portion of the cocaine was designated for Acosta, and the rest for other organizations, which then transported it through British Columbia and Sonora. They paid Pablo Acosta from $1,000 to $1,500 per kilogram for the use of space, storage, and transport services, and he ensured everything at the highest level, details of which are known from a DEA informant's words. Thus, the informant provided information about an aircraft arriving with 816 kilograms of cocaine in Ojinaga in May 1985. The aircraft landed at a ranch 30 miles south of Ojinaga. The cocaine was packaged in 1-kilogram bricks, round or rectangular in shape, which, according to the witness, resembled cheese wafers. The cargo was unloaded and transported by truck to an underground bunker, located about 1 meter below ground near the airstrip. After the cocaine was placed in the tank, the pit was filled with dirt, and no one from the outside would suspect the existence of such a drug cache. On the evening of the same day, Acosta gave $20 to each soldier of the Ojinaga garrison who had participated in escorting the merchandise. The cargo was then divided into 7 parts and hidden in propane tanks of trucks, which then delivered it to the United States via the Loma de Arena crossing. Later, information emerged about direct meetings in Colombia between Pablo Acosta and Carlos Leder, during which they arranged ever-increasing supplies of cocaine through Ojinaga. The DEA informant claimed that between 1985 and 1986, Pablo Acosta transported 5 metric tons of cocaine to the United States per month. If the payment for each transported kilogram was $1,250, simple calculations show that Pablo Acosta received $6,250,000 per month, or $75 million annually, solely for the use of his infrastructure by the Colombians, a very lucrative courier service. And this was just one of the access points into the United States through which the Guadalajara Cartel operated. Through Tijuana, Tecate, Mexicali, San Luis Rio Colorado, Nogales, and Ciudad Juarez. According to the most conservative DEA estimates, many times more merchandise passed than Pablo Acosta trafficked through Ojinaga. It is also important to emphasize the relationship between Colombians and Mexicans. Diego Azor, for his book on the history of the Sinaloa cartel, interviewed Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo's lawyer. The lawyer asserted that not only business but also friendly relations had been established between the leaders of the 2 largest groups, Gallardo and Escobar. Were they just business partners? No, they were also friends, and very good friends. Escobar was a professional in his field, and Miguel had great influence in his, and Escobar, of course, managed affairs well in Medellin and in Mexico. What can we conclude from these words? The trust born from friendship and mutual sympathy between the 2 bosses reduced the risk of agreements, and consequently also reduced the need to take preventive punitive measures in unclear situations. Friendship strengthened business relationships. In addition to friendship, there was also mutual respect for the power each possessed within their territories. Therefore, throughout this time, no open clashes between Mexicans and Colombians were recorded, which attests to one thing. A reliable and effective partnership had been established between them. Thus, the secret passage through Mexico proved to be, in fact, much more convenient and productive than the main passage in Florida, and Mexican drug traffickers were more than satisfied. But it was obvious that Gallardo had an advantage over Escobar, not only in terms of logistics, but also in distribution in the United States. As time passed, the relationship between Colombians and Mexicans gradually expanded, and the terms of the initial agreement shifted in Guadalajara's favor. As it would later turn out, the Colombians usually paid cash for each shipment. The first shipments were paid in pesos, then in dollars. But after a certain period, Gallardo realized that money could depreciate, and it would be much more convenient to deal directly with the merchandise. Distributing it directly on the North American market meant making a night's move, and it was when the Colombian cartel began to deliver more shipments that he asked to be paid in merchandise, and Escobar agreed. It even seemed convenient to him. The conditions were as follows. If the cargo was easy to transport and hide in a train or truck, 35% of the cocaine went to the Mexicans. If everything was more complicated and, for example, underground tunnels had to be used, they received 50% of the cargo. By 1984, the Mexicans had become not only transporters but also distributors. This often happens in legal business as well. The distributor becomes the main competitor of the producer, and the subsidiary's revenues exceed the parent company's profits. Gallardo knew perfectly well that, over time, his profits and his associates would become more visible. He understood that he should not show off, especially at a time when everyone's attention was focused on Escobar and Colombia. And it must be said that, for some time, he succeeded. He led a modest life, more like a manager than an emperor. He carefully monitored deliveries, because he knew that everything had to go smoothly. One had to pay at every checkpoint, to every officer responsible for a certain area, to every village mayor through which one had to pass. Gallardo understood that one had to pay. Pay for one's fortune to be perceived as universal. Pay before someone spoke, betrayed, gossiped, or offered more, before they handed you over to an enemy group or the police. The source of the drug traffickers' power was not intelligence, but money. Tens of billions of dollars, unimaginable sums 10 years earlier. Money bought weapons, hideouts, and ultimately the ability to command provincial and even central governments. No criminal enterprise had ever had as much money as that at the disposal of drug traffickers in Latin and North America. And from where it came, there was much more. Rivers of dollars flowed from the United States, whose population seemed to have an insatiable appetite for cocaine. Meanwhile, the DEA agents stationed in Guadalajara knew very little about Gallardo's ongoing operations, although the agency had known about him since 1975. By 1979, Gallardo began appearing in Drug Enforcement Administration files as an intermediary, specializing in small cocaine shipments to Arizona and Los Angeles. The American government was more interested in criminals crossing the border, and they regularly arrested them, just as they regularly intercepted drug shipments. Newspapers constantly reported on the fight against drug traffickers: 200 kilograms in Miami, 100 kilograms in Arizona, but a complete picture did not emerge. The Mexican government prohibited U.S. aerial reconnaissance flights over its territory. Furthermore, the DEA did not enjoy diplomatic immunity. The Mexican government had only granted diplomatic status to DEA agents in Mexico City, but had refused to grant similar privileges to agents in local offices. Since the 1970s, an unwritten agreement persisted between the DEA and high-ranking central government officials that DEA agents could carry personal firearms. But when they did, they violated Mexican laws and consequently were at the mercy of local officials. So they couldn't even draw their weapons. Ronald Reagan, upon assuming the presidency, declared at his first press conference in 1981 that he would not fight drug trafficking, but would take customers away from drug traffickers. But his domestic anti-drug program was not particularly successful, nor was his foreign one. The fight against Latin narco barons inevitably intertwined with politics and diplomacy. First, Latin American countries owed billions of dollars to American creditors, and an open fight against drugs represented a direct threat to multinational corporations, large banks, and their representatives in the Treasury Department. Second, Reagan himself was obsessed with Soviet and Cuban activism. More important than all narco barons was the repression of left-wing guerrilla movements in Central and South America. They were particularly determined to maintain American influence in two strategically important Latin American countries, despite evidence that their governments were repressive and steeped in corruption. These were Panama, where the strategically important Panama Canal and a base for 10,000 American soldiers are located, and Mexico, which was the third largest trading partner of the United States and the largest source of imported oil. Reagan zealously addressed the drug problem only in one case, when it was believed that left-wing guerrillas or Marxist governments were trafficking drugs in exchange for weapons. But when DEA agents discovered evidence of corruption in non-communist countries willing to cooperate in resisting Cuban and Soviet intervention, Reagan showed surprising indifference. The 6 agents of the DEA office in Guadalajara were not particularly pleased with their country's policy and the constantly deteriorating working conditions. The American government's stance was unequivocal. Mexico's anti-drug campaign was an exemplary program. Relations between the DEA and Mexican police were excellent, and the situation was under control. In reality, nothing was under control. Gallardo, for example, was a respected hotel owner who regularly appeared in the press for various reasons. Sometimes he sponsored a university, sometimes something else. He had a luxury car garage as large as a decent house, which in Guadalajara was known even by a deaf-mute, and he was effectively the shadow governor of the city of Cabor. During the same period, the DEA's Guadalajara office comprised at best 7 agents: James Kuykendall, Pete Fernandez, Butch Sears, Roger Knapp, Victor Wallace, Victor Cortez, and Enrique Camarena, whose jurisdiction was limited solely to observation work. All of them arrived in the early 1980s and dedicated themselves to observation. In 1982, Félix Gallardo's cocaine organization came under the spotlight of an intelligence project led by Butch Sears. The project was called Operation Godfather and baffled all employees of the office. The block diagram on the bulletin board looked like a spider web. Ultimately, they concluded that Félix Gallardo was not only the largest cocaine trafficker in Mexico, but one of the largest drug traffickers in the Western Hemisphere in general. His organization had grown to such an extent that it shipped 1.5 to 2 tons of cocaine per month, which made him as influential as the Medellin drug traffickers. They began to realize a startling fact. Although there were more agents in Mexico than in any other foreign country, none of the new generation of narco bosses had been indicted in the United States. If Caro Quintero or Félix Gallardo had appeared at DEA headquarters, American agents would have had nothing left to do but offer him a beer. Kuykendall, the head of the office, told his agents that he wanted them to find out everything possible about the cartel leaders and their silent partners in the political and economic establishment. This went against the demands of their headquarters, but he didn't care. Among all the few agents, Enrique Camarena, nicknamed Kiki, stood out. Enrique Camarena Salazar was born on July 26, 1947, in Mexicali, Mexico. Later, his parents moved to the United States, where Kiki graduated from Calexico High School in California in 1966, and in 1968 he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. After 2 years of impeccable service in the Marines, Kiki worked as a firefighter, police officer, and county deputy sheriff in his hometown. Kiki joined the Drug Enforcement Administration in June 1974. In 1977, after 3 years of working in Calexico, he was transferred to the Fresno office in Northern California. And 4 years later, Kiki received transfer orders to Guadalajara. By 1980, at the time of his transfer to Guadalajara, he was an experienced undercover agent, having made numerous arrests. He had a wife, Mika, and 2 children, and he could not even imagine what was happening in Mexico, because his work in America consisted, in large part, of investigating small drug dealers and sometimes confiscating drug shipments. Yes, the work was dangerous, stressful, but the scale was completely different. In Guadalajara, Kiki fully immersed himself in his projects, focusing on Rafael Caro Quintero. Rafa, unlike Gallardo and Don Neto, lived an open life. Among the three bosses, only he enjoyed popularity among the people and did not hesitate to drive around the city in his luxury cars. Caro Quintero and Don Neto, according to informants, dealt in marijuana, not cocaine. In May 1982, one of Camarina's informants told a bizarre story. In the state of San Luis Potosí, about 200 miles northeast of Guadalajara, marijuana was growing on 220 acres. The agents were skeptical. The plantation, described by the man, would be visible from everywhere, being in the middle of Mexico's wide central desert. The informant insisted that the plantation existed and the cannabis was irrigated by underground wells. The marijuana stalks, he said, were already 5 feet tall. The plantation, he said, belongs to Rafa, Don Neto, and El Azul. The agents understood that if the informant's words were confirmed, it would completely debunk the Mexican crop eradication campaign, according to whose reports there had been no giant fields in Mexico since Operation Condor. The fact was that in 1982, Mexico's Attorney General's office, responsible for crop eradication, divided the country into zones. Aircraft, provided by the United States government, were supposed to fly over these zones at regular intervals. Although it was difficult to spot a marijuana field on the wooded western slopes of the Sierra Madre or in the jungles of Veracruz, a field of such size in the desert would stand out like a neon green square at any time of day. It turned out that Rafa, Neto, and Azul's group had planted a third of a square mile in the San Luis Desert, and no one had noticed it at all. This meant one of two things. Either Mexican officials were aware but not saying anything, or they were unaware because they were not conducting intelligence operations. In the first case, most likely, the employees had simply been bribed. In the second case, they were transporting American money in aircraft under false pretenses and for unknown purposes. In any event, it was a slap in the face to Uncle Sam. It also meant that someone was making a lot of money. Marijuana plantations in the Sierra Madre yielded modest profits due to rather high transport and handling costs. Marijuana is a rather difficult substance to transport. Unlike cocaine or heroin, it has a strong odor and cannot be compressed into a convenient 1-kilogram brick, like cocaine. A small volume of cannabis for sale takes up a lot of space, and the only way to get rich from marijuana is to cultivate and sell this commodity on a large scale, as the Colombians did. This was difficult to achieve in the rugged mountains of the Sierra Madre, but if Mexico's arid central highlands were transformed into an agricultural enterprise with intensive irrigation and tons of fertilizers, as happened in California's central valleys, the potential profits would be enormous. The simplest way to discover what was happening was to fly over the location. But DEA agents needed official accompaniment to do so, and they were not prepared to reveal what they knew to Mexican federal agents. Kiki began searching for even more informants. According to Camarina's case documents, they reported that federal force commanders guarded the plantation and delivered weapons to it. They said that El Azul's assistant had given a new Ford pickup truck to an Army lieutenant. DEA agents became increasingly convinced that the information about the giant plantation was not an invention. The more we found out, the more we were struck by what was happening, Kuykendall would later recount. He himself attempted to impress upon State Department officials in Mexico City the importance of this plantation. In August of 1982, he attended an embassy staff meeting and presented the evidence gathered by Camarina. The diplomats dismissed Kuykendall, as such a plantation simply could not exist as confirmed by the Mexicans. It was a catch-22 situation. Camarina had no proof because he couldn't fly over the area. He couldn't fly over the area because he had no proof. Mexico's Attorney General's office would not send a DEA agent into that area without a request from the embassy, and the embassy was unwilling to raise the issue without solid evidence. Camarina returned to work. He obtained a photograph of the area and enough details to convince the embassy of the plantation's existence. In early September of 1982, Camarena's testimonies were presented to Mexico's Attorney General's office. They were so convincing that Mexican authorities finally ordered a search and destroy operation. In early September, 7 helicopters took off, carrying a group of military personnel and agents of the Mexican Federal Judicial Police, including Camarena and Kuykendall. Despite everything they had heard previously, the Drug Enforcement Administration agents were stunned when the helicopters broke through the cloud cover and an emerald green marijuana plantation appeared on the horizon. The raid set a record. 200 tons of high-quality Sinsemilla marijuana were harvested. The plantation had been cultivated using the most modern agricultural techniques. The fields were irrigated by 3 deep wells, and 20 tons of chemical fertilizers were stored in a shed. Nearby were barracks with beds for 100 people and fresh food in the kitchen, but within several miles there was not a living soul. According to Camarena's informants, a police officer, informed of the action, notified the cartel shortly before the raid, giving the workers time to escape. The public ministry of San Luis Potosí gave Camarena evasive answers when he tried to obtain documents related to the ownership of the field. Camarena handed over the information he had received from informants about the alleged owner of the field, Antonio Perez Parga, but Perez was ultimately never arrested. It was there, in the field, among robust man-high plants of the most expensive marijuana variety, that agents understood that only fighting corruption and at very high levels would solve the drug trafficking problem. Federal judicial police, the army, and government officials at every level were involved, but they clashed with the bureaucracy of the United States State Department as well as their own superiors. High-ranking DEA representatives at the embassy doubted that this discovery had such great significance. They declared it was a stroke of luck, Kuykendall later recounted, and that it was a unique case. There were no others like it. We, on the other hand, were convinced it was everywhere. A few weeks later, Camarena received news of a second large plantation owned by Rafael Caro Quintero in the state of Sonora. Kuykendall relayed the information to the DEA office in Mexico City, which, in turn, persuaded the Mexican Federal Police Headquarters and the Army to dispatch a raid team. Roger Knapp, who had recently joined the DEA group, went to Culiacan to join the federal agents. The fields were precisely where the informant had indicated. 170 acres of marijuana waved openly under the sky. Knapp and the federal agents traveled to Ciudad Obregón and spent the night there, intending to begin the eradication at dawn. Waking up at 6 o'clock in the morning, they discovered that the Culiacan federal police commander was waiting for them. This commander, who was rumored to be a close friend of El Azul, had been deliberately excluded from the raid. Apparently, he had found out overnight because he had arrived through the mountains in Sonora. In the morning, the commander insisted on a postponement. After waiting all day, Knapp decided the situation was hopeless and returned to Guadalajara. An informant later told him that the federal agents had confiscated some of the marijuana but had allowed the crops in other fields to be harvested that day. DEA agents in Guadalajara understood the extent of the Mexican octopus and also knew why this was happening. The government, at a high level, gave drug traffickers tacit consent to any maneuver, a true social pact in which everyone understood each other at first glance. However, the government still represented the interests of the state, not of drug traffickers, and therefore could still be persuaded or pressured to take decisive measures. And this kind of persuasion had to be done by the President of the United States, the highest officials of his administration, and Congress. And this certainly could not be done by a dozen agents who did not even have the right to arrest abroad and carry weapons. In early 1983, Kuykendall traveled to a meeting of Drug Enforcement Administration representatives in San Antonio, armed with a bundle of photographs in which Camarena posed in fields with 5-foot-tall Sinsemilla plants. When asked to explain what it was, he replied, "Corruption." The photographs did not produce a wow effect on anyone, and he simply returned to Guadalajara. DEA agents continued to gather information on their own, as best they could, and only at the last moment did they turn to the Mexican Federal Judicial Police. There were some brave local police officers who were not opposed to making arrests, but only if two factors were met. They had to be found and properly agreed upon, and their superior could not be on the payroll of the drug trafficker being sought. In most cases, information about every move of DEA agents immediately reached the cartel. Camarena spent a significant amount of time in the Federal Judicial Police Office attempting to glean any useful information. For a period, he even believed he had a couple of friends, until he discovered that those very individuals were on the payroll of Caro Quintero and Don Neto. Ultimately, the employees of the Guadalajara office concluded that the Federal Judicial Police was such an unreliable authority that they stopped sharing confidential information with them, even with those employees who seemed willing to help. DEA agents could never be sure that the people they considered allies weren't playing a double game. Neither DEA headquarters nor the U.S. Attorney's Office along the border showed any interest in indicting Caro Quintero, Félix Gallardo, and the other bosses. Federal prosecutors were unwilling to expend time and effort prosecuting conspiracy charges against foreign nationals who rarely came to the United States. DEA departments usually focused on easily manageable drug cases. The only cartel member who had been indicted at that time was Don Neto, and that case had been initiated by customs agents in San Diego, but it had stalled due to interagency squabbles between the U.S. Attorney's Office, the DEA, and Customs. The investigation began in December 1982, when customs agents who were investigating money laundering were tipped off about a group of Mexicans smuggling large sums of cash from San Diego to Tijuana. The trail led to a house in the Santa Fe Ranch, an exclusive suburb situated high on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Don Neto and Rafa's relatives lived in the house. They used a pager service and a pager to control the delivery of large shipments of marijuana, heroin, and cocaine to Los Angeles and to transfer millions of dollars to Mexico. Customs officials approached the U.S. Attorney's Office for a court order to tap the house's telephone. The local DEA branch agreed, but mid-level managers at DEA headquarters objected on the grounds that customs agents were supposed to be involved in smuggling investigations and did not have jurisdiction to handle wiretaps under national drug trafficking laws. After 1 month of bureaucratic battles, authorization for the wiretaps was obtained, but on January 28, 1983, Don Neto left the city. When customs officials arrived at the house, they found clothes in the closet and food on the table. By mid-1983, Kiki Camarena was already convinced that Caro Quintero was cultivating immense plantations of elite and profitable sinsemilla in the Central Highlands. He ardently desired to fly over the Sierra Madre on his own terms and devised a plan: charter a plane, hire a pilot, and conduct his own aerial reconnaissance without Mexican government pilots. It was a radical idea, and Camarena knew it. He named his plan Operation Miracle because, as he told Kuykendall with a sad smile, it would be a miracle if anyone approved it. In the ensuing months, during meetings with DEA leadership in Mexico City, Kuykendall championed the idea of DEA-led aerial monitoring. He insisted that the State Department was deliberately underestimating marijuana production figures to account for the diplomatic sensitivity with Mexico. The tension between Mexico City and the Guadalajara office sharpened, particularly after Ed Heath, who was completely disoriented by the situation, was appointed DEA attaché in Mexico City in mid-1983. Furthermore, according to Kuykendall, Ed Heath had the worst form of obsequiousness imaginable. Heath would befriend officials from the Mexican Attorney General's office and Federal Judicial Police headquarters, particularly its director Manuel Ibarra. His slow and deferential approach to his irritable Mexican counterpart satisfied many political officials at the U.S. Embassy, but led to clashes with field agents. Diplomacy has always been the art of compromise, but most DEA field agents viewed compromise as a slippery slope because they understood how the system worked and what lubricated its gears. Anticipating the facts, I will state that Ed Heath's new friend, Manuel Ibarra, would appear before an American court in 1990 for the Kiki Camarena murder case. So the issues of antagonism between the center and the periphery were not matters of personal relationships. They were, in a literal sense, matters of life and death for the agents, unprotected, unlike Ed Heath, by diplomatic immunity. Thus, in the summer of 1983, after Camarena and Sears had spent several months identifying members of Caro Quintero's network in Guadalajara, Heath ordered Kuykendall to send the names and addresses obtained. Heath assured that he would personally arrange for a reliable operational team of federal agents from Mexico City to Guadalajara for the searches. Kuykendall didn't like the idea, but he had no choice. It was a direct order. So the immaculate federal agents arrived in Guadalajara and settled into the Las Americas Motel, which belonged to, yes, you guessed it, Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo. By the time the searches began at all the addresses, no one was there anymore. Camarena and his partners had spent months trying to find new addresses and phone numbers of the gang members. In May 1983, Agent Pete Hernandez gave up, requesting a transfer to Texas. He told his colleagues in the Guadalajara office that he wanted to put someone who would stay there in prison. He was tired of the harassment from Mexican federal agents. A few months later, Butch Sears found a vacant position in Bolivia and applied. He said that, in his opinion, Bolivia might be corrupt and backward, but the American embassy employees and DEA agents at least were there on the same side. He was referring to his futile attempts to reach the government with a request to open access to Gallardo's bank accounts, which could shed light on the inner workings of the cocaine trafficking organization. Camarena, Hernandez, and Knapp managed to recruit informants for the Caro Quintero operation with relative ease. But this happened only because marijuana trafficking required thousands of farmers, supervisors, engineers, truck drivers, and guards, and this branch of the Guadalajara Cartel's business was highly visible, as was Rafa himself. But they couldn't even get close to Félix Gallardo's business. Finished cocaine trafficking was capital-intensive, but not labor-intensive. A man like El Padrino, as Gallardo was also called, needed a small group of trusted assistants to manage his business, but he had to be able to transfer millions of dollars to many countries to pay for cocaine, planes, trucks, and bribes. Sears believed that the best way to penetrate the cocaine business was to analyze financial operations. Thus, as early as 1982, during his Operation Godfather, Sears suspected that Félix Gallardo had acquired a stake in a Guadalajara bank to launder money. He asked the Mexican government for the drug traffickers' banking details, but received a categorical refusal. Later that same year, DEA agents in Lima stumbled upon a cashier's check from Bank of America in San Diego. The agents were surprised to discover that Félix Gallardo's organization had transferred $20 million through a single Bank of America account in 1 month. At that rate, the agents calculated, the gang could earn $200 million a year or even more, considering that large anti-drug operations had scattered their assets across many banks. As agents developed their schemes, proceeds from cocaine sales on the West Coast were collected and trucked to Guadalajara, deposited there in Félix Gallardo's bank, and transferred back to Bank of America in San Diego. Félix Gallardo's financial agent, Tomás Valles Corral, withdrew money in the form of cashier's checks for $40,000 or $50,000 and sent them to South America to pay cocaine producers. The cashed checks became invaluable information for the DEA. Now they knew where Gallardo was getting his cocaine. Some checks had been cashed in little-known towns in the jungles of Colombia, some in the Peruvian Andes, some on the border between Peru and Bolivia. 4 checks totaling $200,000 ended up in Switzerland in the hands of Roberto Suarez Jr., a representative of the famous Bolivian cocaine family. Sears and Kelly took copies of the cashed checks to Mexico City to show them to representatives of banking regulatory authorities and Mexican customs officials. They once again requested access to Mexican bank reports, which, in their opinion, could reveal information about Félix Gallardo's partners and investments, and once again the request was denied. Sears hoped that someone at the embassy would raise the issue in high-level meetings, but everyone remained silent. And yet he was so close to the truth. In reality, his calculations of $20 million a year were far from the truth. It's hard to believe, but by 1985, Mexican drug traffickers' proceeds from cocaine and sinsemilla sales exceeded $5 billion a year. and bank intermediation was not the least cause of such a level of profit. In fact, banks played a decisive role in the international expansion of Mexican trade. It was a significant technological change, as important as learning to cultivate sinsemilla. Drug traffickers quickly and efficiently transferred money between countries. Gone were those agonizing days when one had to carry suitcases full of cash and wait in bars and hotels for tense deliveries. Agent Sears' mood briefly improved when an informant passed him the radio frequencies that Félix Gallardo's communication network used to manage planes and trucks. The DEA's Guadalajara office approached the CIA station in Mexico City to request the establishment of a radio traffic monitoring system, but received no response. So the agents independently purchased equipment from a Radio Shack store in the United States and assembled their own monitoring system. Sears said that was the last straw, and he flew to Bolivia shortly before Easter in 1984. Agent Knapp, who had replaced Sears, received information that a large shipment of cocaine was arriving in Guadalajara, and Félix Gallardo was expected to appear there in person. Federal headquarters in Mexico City agreed to send another reliable team of agents. Encouraged, Knapp waited for the federal agents to catch Gallardo red-handed, but, as you can imagine, the delivery never arrived, and Félix Gallardo did not appear. Meanwhile, in the United States, everything was still going well. Members of Congress and journalists had never heard of Gallardo's expanding cocaine empire or the gigantic marijuana plantations that financed Rafa and Don Neto. The Reagan administration remained silent. On June 22, 1983, Dominic Di Carlo, Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of International Narcotics Matters, presented an encouraging report praising Mexico's efforts in eradicating marijuana and opium. According to Di Carlo, the Mexican program had been so successful that producers, in response, had planted tiny, more isolated and difficult-to-reach fields. In the marijuana fields that Camarena and his partners found in the desert, there was nothing tiny and difficult to reach, but Di Carlo did not mention these large, open plantations at all. The position of the State Department's Anti-Drug Assistance Department in Mexico City was that desert fields were an anomaly. Their priority was opium, and in Sinaloa, a region where poppy and marijuana cultivation was a very difficult enterprise due to the terrain and the risk of aerial surveillance. Meanwhile, DEA agents in Guadalajara discovered another large desert plantation, 200 acres of sinsemilla in Zacatecas. They warned federal agents, who sent a report with photos of the complete destruction of the plantations. Subsequently, 2 informants reported to DEA agents that the marijuana had actually been carefully harvested and packaged by Mexican army soldiers. And so, while American agencies solved problems on the South American continent, while they blamed each other and fought on the fronts of the Cold War against communists, by January 1984, marijuana seizures along the southwestern border had increased 5-fold compared to 1980. If anyone wasn't wasting time, it was the almost eradicated, according to Mexican government reports, enterprising drug traffickers of the Guadalajara Cartel. At the borders, there was a catastrophically low number of customs officers and even fewer DEA agents. Requests to headquarters to strengthen the border received no response. A couple of months later, the Tucson office made the largest seizure in 10 years, 2 trucks with marijuana weighing almost 1 ton. Around this time, in early 1984, Kiki Camarena's investigation took a major turn. An informant revealed that Guadalajara traffickers had formed a syndicate to finance thousands of acres of sinsemilla marijuana plantations in Chihuahua. The list literally represented the top 30 of the Mexican drug industry: Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Juan Nepomuceno Guerra, and 21 other names, each of whom Kiki knew. Camarena began to dig deeper. In violation of the U.S.-Mexico agreement, which prohibited aerial surveillance by American agents, Camarena hired Captain Alfredo Zavala Avalar, a former Mexican military pilot, to fly over the state of Chihuahua in order to personally see the marijuana fields. And they were there. Back at the consulate, Camarena and Kuykendall wrote numerous telegrams about their discovery. According to Camarena's case documents, he and his informants reported that Felipe Aparicio Núñez, director of the DFS, and Guadalupe Gutierrez, a federal police general, not only took money to look the other way, but invested in upcoming marijuana cultivation ventures. One informant claimed to have seen Aparicio Núñez personally collect 50 million pesos from a transporter for Rafael Caro Quintero. Another informant said that Gutierrez was ready to welcome drug traffickers into his territory and provide them with all kinds of assistance. Furthermore, when Camarena and Canap spoke with General Gutierrez about his dealings with drug traffickers, he openly declared to the Americans, "They come and make you an offer," Canap recalled the general's words, "We'll get rich or we'll kill, so it's better to be rich than dead." In late May, Ed Heath's trusted deputy from the central office, Walter White, informed Camarena and Kuykendall that federal agents were aware of the Zacatecas plantations and planned a raid. From a phone call, Kuykendall concluded that Heath, as usual, had informed Federal Judicial Police Headquarters and his friend Ibarra. Shortly thereafter, federal agents, led by Commander Ibarra, invaded the plantations. 20 tons of marijuana were confiscated from 150 acres of fields. According to Mexican newspapers, Ibarra announced that 177 people had been arrested in connection with the case, but, as usual, among the arrested there were no significant names from that list. The raid made headlines in Mexican newspapers, but Camarena was discouraged by the meager haul compared to what, in his opinion, was there. And what was worse, the Guadalajara Cartel now knew who Kiki Camarena was and what he looked like. Having violated one rule, which prohibited flying over plantations alone, Camarena violated another, which prohibited working undercover. Tired of the constant games played by federal agents, Kiki, undercover, went to the Zacatecas plantation, looked around, and asked an informant to introduce him to Rafa's friend, Emmanuel Chavez, who was later arrested but released after a short time. Chavez had seen Camarena with the federal agents during the arrest, and it was most likely he who reported to Rafa who Kiki was. But Kiki was already unstoppable. He found new informants among traders and farmers connected to the fields, and by midsummer 1984, DEA agents learned that Caro Quintero and his associates were establishing more large plantations in the desert states of Chihuahua, Sonora, and Baja California. Rafa, meanwhile, was in no way restrained by the unwanted attention he was receiving from the intrusive Americans. He acquired dozens of ranches and villas throughout northern and central Mexico. He purchased 25 acres of land in an affluent Guadalajara suburb for $4 million in cash. Around the perimeter of the property, he erected a 5-meter-high concrete wall and laid the foundation for the construction of a luxurious residence. When this ostentatious villa was built, everyone in Guadalajara could see that Rafael Caro Quintero was not a criminal. Criminals hid in holes, while Rafael Caro Quintero lived wherever he pleased. But the same newspaper article about the raid with the seizure of 20 tons in Zacatecas did have some effect, but it was not the activity of the Guadalajara DEA section that caused it, but rather the constant, practically exponential increase in marijuana seizures along the American border. Mexican marijuana and heroin were available throughout the American Southwest, and prices were low. This undeniable fact made the Mexican government's statements about the massive destruction of plantations implausible. The flight logs of American crop duster helicopters, compiled by the Mexican Attorney General's office, showed that the helicopters flew only 25% of the time. For many years they had not been properly maintained, the spare parts warehouse was empty, and informants who worked in various sections of the Drug Enforcement Administration in Mexico reported that herbicides were diluted with water or even dumped in the desert. Ed Heath began to promote the idea that the Mexican drug eradication program still required DEA intervention. State Department representatives in Washington also concluded that decisive measures were needed. But Ambassador Gavin, concerned about Mexico's debt crisis and seeking to cool Mexico's relations with Nicaragua, was opposed to radical changes in Mexico's anti-drug campaign. Ultimately, an interagency agreement was reached, according to which the embassy would ask the Mexican government to allow DEA observer agents to fly over poppy or marijuana fields that were to be sprayed so that the United States could independently verify claims of crop destruction. Ed Heath called the project Operation Vanguard. At first glance, the Vanguard plan resembled Kiki Camarena's Operation Miracle, but Camarena maintained that DEA pilots should fly planes with the ability to control the flight. In Heath's plan, however, the planes and pilots were Mexican, and DEA agents were passengers without the right to control the flight. When Camarena heard about the Mexican pilots, according to Kuykendall, he wanted nothing to do with the project. The planes departed for their first flight on November 1, 1984. The DEA agents on board confirmed the Guadalajara agents' worst suspicions. Marijuana and opium were growing more abundantly than one could imagine. And in the fall of that same 1984, a gang war erupted on the streets of Guadalajara. Rival traffickers ambushed each other and the police on avenues and in cafes. For the American agents, the course of events confirmed the Mexican government was relinquishing any pretense of control over drug-related crime. Victor Wallace, who had replaced Butch Sears, who flew to Bolivia, arrived in Guadalajara in September 1984. As soon as he started duty, Kuykendall and Kiki sat him down and advised him to never relax. Guadalajara is not America, where every bandit knows, if you kill a cop, things get bad. On October 10th, Agent Roger Knapp's parked car was hit by bullets. Knapp was sure it was Félix Gallardo's work. It was in that very car that Knapp had surveilled Gallardo a couple of months earlier, when he had been forcibly pulled from the car and interrogated by El Padrino's bodyguards, who had discovered his badge. Earlier that year, Félix Gallardo had demonstrated that he was aware of Operation Godfather and the increased attention to his bank accounts, and that he did not like it. On March 28th, a former Federal Forces commander visited Camarena with a message from Gallardo. It said that it would be wise for DEA agents to finally leave Mr. Félix alone, that he was an honest businessman, and that it would be better for them to hunt Rafael Caro Quintero. But the DEA intensified investigations, not only in Mexico, but throughout the Southwest. In June of 1984, the DEA's Guadalajara office received a tip that led their fellow agents in Los Angeles to a motel room in Anaheim. Inside, $4 million in cash with traces of cocaine were found. Fragments of documents found in the room led to bank accounts in San Isidro, Laredo, and El Paso, controlled by Tomas Valles Corral. DEA agents managed to confiscate $13 million linked to Gallardo's organization, but they had no illusions about what they had achieved. "What we have here are pennies," said Agent Scott Adams of the DEA's El Paso office. In August, Gila County, Arizona, deputy sheriffs accidentally seized 600 pounds of cocaine, the traces of which were linked to Félix Gallardo's network. Such an amount of cocaine would have fetched $30 million or even more on the Los Angeles wholesale market. The Drug Enforcement Administration had no role in this seizure. A tired state police officer and his wife were cutting wood, saw a plane land, and suspected something strange, and then contacted law enforcement. Nevertheless, Félix Gallardo apparently blamed the DEA. Roger Knapp heard rumors circulating that the gringos were in big trouble, and so were all those who had been seen with them. When his car was shot, Knapp assumed that Félix Gallardo had preemptively agreed to the warning with high-ranking federal police officials. Firstly, uniformed police arrived almost immediately at the scene. They usually took 30 minutes to respond to a call, and Federal Police Commander Flores also appeared. Knapp decided that he was checking that no one had been injured. After the police left, Knapp called Mexico City and reported the incident to Walter White, Heath's deputy. Shortly thereafter, White called back and said that headquarters wanted Knapp to return to the United States as soon as possible. Knapp had no desire to leave at all. He had done a huge amount of investigative work on Félix Gallardo's organization's activities, and this was finally beginning to bear fruit. He had a feeling that a breakthrough was imminent. White spoke again with headquarters and obtained a stay, but the next day, Knapp learned that the DEA's Los Angeles office had seized 200 kilograms of cocaine, which apparently belonged to Gallardo. The seizure occurred only a few hours after the shooting at Knapp's car. "It's time to go," Knapp told his wife. He had had no role in this seizure, but Félix Gallardo's hitmen did not know that. The remaining agents were three: James Kuykendall, Kiki Camarena, and the newcomer Shaggy. Ambassador Gavin visited Attorney General Sergio Garcia Ramirez and Interior Minister Manuel Bartlett Diaz. He delivered the message that, if any unpleasant incident, like with Knapp, were to happen again to a DEA agent, the United States would consider it an extremely serious matter with very profound and very long-term consequences. Kuykendall was furious. He believed the ambassador should have caused a scandal, but that did not happen. And so, with their actions, they had, in a sense, untied the hands of the drug traffickers. You could threaten, and the agent would go home. Something bad had to happen, Kuykendall said desperately. Kiki agreed with him in the pessimistic predictions, but neither of them intended to leave, especially since the pilot Zavala had recently told him about the Buffalo Ranch, Rafael Caro Quintero's main project. According to rumors, it was an incredible investment project for which several of the biggest kingpins had united, and not only in the field of drug trafficking. Flights over the field without the owner's permission were prohibited, and its maintenance required a colossal amount of service personnel who came from everywhere, from Sinaloa, Sonora, Guerrero, Jalisco, Chiapas, and even Guatemala. Kiki and Kuykendall reported the discovery to headquarters, and it turned out that at least 3 DEA offices from different parts of Mexico had also heard about Buffalo. Heath relayed this information to Mexico's Attorney General's office. A few days later, the official response arrived that the information was untrue. There was nothing in the desert. Then, Heath pressured the Attorney General's office and federal headquarters. Finally, Mexican authorities agreed to assemble a raid team. Late in the evening on November 6th, representatives of the federal police, the Attorney General's office, and the Army met with a group of DEA agents and planned the attack. Early the next morning, they would move troops into the Chihuahua Desert. Commander Aldana Ibarra would lead the assault team. At dawn, the raiders headed to Chihuahua near the village of Buffalo. Mexican and American law enforcement on board the helicopters saw irrigated fields, barracks, and drying sheds 30 to 50 feet wide and 300 to 400 feet long. It took the raiders 2 days to reconnoiter the area. The scale of the project was astounding. The Mexican government confiscated and destroyed 5,000 to 10,000 tons of high-quality sinsemilla. There were 5 cultivation areas, 25 to 30 drying sheds, most of which were as large as a football field. This capture set a new world record. No one had ever seen so much marijuana in one place. The fields were irrigated with water pumped from deep wells, were well fertilized, and cultivated with the latest intensive and high-tech agricultural methods. There was much more marijuana in this location than could be grown in the fields, which led agents to conclude that the Chihuahua complex was a storage and processing center for marijuana grown throughout Mexico. Several informants reported to agents that the complex belonged to a syndicate created by Rafael Caro Quintero. Later, Caro Quintero confirmed that the complex was his property and complained that he had invested $20 million in it. DEA representatives estimated that if the marijuana had been sold on the street, it would have fetched over $2.5 billion. In 3 plots, approximately 7,000 frightened farmers were found. They had been hired, offered an enormous sum of 2,500 pesos per day, about $6, to work in the fields. The unfortunate people lived in horrific conditions. Armed guards ensured they did not escape, and those who tried were shot with machine guns. The workers were fed potatoes, sour tortillas, hard beans, and coffee. Some of them recounted that around midnight, about 5 hours before the government troops landed, their field supervisors received news of the approaching troops and ordered the workers to leave. But they could not go far. They had no means of transport and very few provisions. Some of them wandered for 3 days in the desert without food or water until they were found. According to DEA agents, among the arrested were 5 men serving in the federal police. State Department officials were skeptical of this claim, but there could be no doubt about the leak of information about the raid to drug traffickers, as this would have meant that at the highest levels of the Mexican government, there was at least one double agent. The preparatory meeting for the raid concluded late in the evening on November 6th, and many people participated: Army officers, the high leadership of the Attorney General's office, and several intelligence commanders. According to testimonies, the workers were told to disperse at midnight on November 7th, which means that the drug traffickers were warned of the event almost immediately after the meeting ended. According to a congressional report, it was also alarming that the tankers, which were supposed to refuel the helicopters, had been sent to the wrong place. Due to this alleged error, the raid was almost canceled. The sheer scale of the Chihuahua complexes threw U.S. government statistics into disarray. In 1983, American analysts concluded that between 12 and 15,000 tons of marijuana were consumed in the United States. Here, in a single location, was at least one-third of that sum. DEA headquarters, the State Department, and the embassy finally listened to what Camarena and his colleagues had been trying to convey since 1982. The plantations existed. The photos caused a sensation. Firstly, a terrible human drama unfolded with the workers, some of whom died of thirst. Secondly, the government began to understand the drug traffickers' main ace in the hole was not secrecy, but intimidation and bribes, many bribes. Ed Heath called the Chihuahua raid the DEA's greatest success, and so it should have been. But Kuykendall was saddened that Camarena had not received the same honor for the plantations previously discovered by Caro Quintero in the desert states. He had nominated him for an award in March 1984, but months passed and the award was never delivered to him. It would be awarded posthumously. And Kuykendall also understood that they would have to face the wrath of the drug traffickers, enraged by the heavy losses simply because Caro Quintero knew they were responsible for his previous losses in Zacatecas, San Luis Potosí, and Sonora. Kuykendall again requested diplomatic passports and reinforcements, but he received none of that. Shortly thereafter, Félix Gallardo's cocaine operation suffered even greater losses at the hands of American law enforcement. In quick succession, on November 17th, California authorities seized $3.7 million in cash linked to Félix Gallardo's network. On November 26th, a Mojave County, Arizona, deputy sheriff accidentally stumbled upon a small plane parked on a deserted airstrip and peered inside. The cargo bay was filled with 700 boxes wrapped like Christmas presents in red, white, and green foil. In the boxes were approximately 1,500 pounds of cocaine. The plane was identified by an informant as belonging to Félix Gallardo. The discovery of the cocaine went almost unnoticed by the American press, but Kuykendall, Camarena, and Wallace were greatly agitated by these seizures. Gallardo had lost $10 million worth of cocaine. They assumed he would send another warning, shoot another car, or perhaps blow up the consulate. And they were right. Although all these seizures had occurred without the participation of the Guadalajara office, the Sinaloans became very angry. According to court testimonies, Mata, Félix Gallardo, and Caro Quintero met to decide what to do about the Americans. Court documents state, members of the organization, including Mata Ballesteros, met and discussed the Drug Enforcement Administration agent responsible for the seizure. Then, the drug traffickers held another meeting where they proposed to scare the agent once his identity was ascertained. The identity was established quite quickly, not least thanks to the very photos of the plantation, which, of course, had reached them through friends in the police. In January 1985, two researchers from the House Committee on Foreign Affairs traveled to Mexico. Kuykendall and Camarena thought they could reach them and that the government would finally take some action, but the investigators advised them to turn to the press to expose local corruption. The State Department would not take drastic measures, as Mexico was strategically important. "What has to happen then?" Camarena said sadly. "Does someone perhaps have to die for them to do something?" And that's pretty much what happened. On February 7, 1985, Camarena exited the American consulate in Guadalajara to have lunch with his wife. He approached his pickup truck when 5 men pointed guns at him. Kiki raised his hands behind his head and was shoved into the car. His wife, not seeing him return, called the police station. Around the same time, pilot Alfredo Zavala disappeared, who, according to witnesses, was shoved into a car by armed men in the same manner. And, as Kiki had predicted, his death served as a catalyst. On February 12th, a press conference was held where the United States ambassador to Mexico, John Gavin, announced that Enrique Camarena Salazar, an American DEA agent, had been kidnapped in Guadalajara. He also publicly declared that suspicion fell on 75 major drug traffickers who ran 18 gangs in Mexico, and that Guadalajara was the operational center for international drug trafficking. Rafael Caro Quintero, around the same time, left Guadalajara in an unknown direction with the assistance of a high-ranking federal police officer. On February 17th, at the U.S.-Mexico border, by order of the American Union government, a unilateral interception operation began with a thorough inspection of individuals and vehicles from the Mexican side. The Mexican government learned of this measure and deemed it unfair. The operation lasted until February 25th, but Kiki was nowhere to be found. Thus began a bitter confrontation between the governments of both countries. The United States wanted the kidnapping of its agent investigated, as U.S. officials were aware of the corruption of many Mexican authorities and feared that this act would go unpunished. The Mexicans, of course, assured that Mexico was not a base for international drug trafficking and denied that their law enforcement had ties to the narco-mafia. And then they adopted a defensive stance, insisting that for all those years their anti-drug policy had yielded recognized results, which had so pleased U.S. politicians. However, the names of the major drug traffickers were still pronounced by the Mexican side: José Ramón Mata Ballesteros, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, Juan José Esparragosa Moreno, and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo. On March 6, 1985, on a ranch in the state of Chihuahua, owned by a former local deputy, the bodies of Camarena and Zavala were discovered. Kiki survived for another 2 days after the kidnapping and, most likely, was buried elsewhere and then deposited at the ranch, where a group of people had previously been shot. His hands and feet were tied, there wasn't a single uninjured spot on his body, and a stick had been shoved into his rectum. The cause of death was blunt force trauma that had crushed his skull. The murder of Kiki Camarena was the final straw for the United States patients, and they were prepared to use every means to ensure that their agent's murder would not go unpunished. Pressure would be exerted on the Mexican government to take action against those directly responsible for the murder, the leaders of drug trafficking, as well as against the police and political network that protected them. And so began lengthy searches for a scapegoat, which led to the most unexpected consequences. First, Ed Heath's former friend, Aldana Ibarra, was fired for undisclosed personal reasons. Then, that general who had helped Caro Quintero escape came under criminal investigation, and in his place stepped Florentino Ventura, a man of crystalline honesty who had once arrested the Sicilian Falcone. He, one of the few, was trusted by the Americans. The state gradually turned against the drug traffickers. Rafael Caro Quintero fled Mexico with the complicity of federal judicial police agents on March 12th, 5 days after the bodies of Camarena and Zavala were found. He traveled to Costa Rica with his girlfriend Sara Cosillo, niece of the important Jalisco politician Guillermo Cosillo Vidaurri, who would later become governor of the state. With Mata Ballesteros' help, Rafa settled in the Central American country, but the pleasure was short-lived. He was hunted by the entire DEA, and they found him precisely because of Sara. She called her parents to inform them about her and Rafa, and in a stroke of good fortune, the call, of course, was immediately intercepted. On April 4, 1985, he was arrested by Costa Rican police and Commander Florentino Ventura. Following the scandal, information about Caro Quintero's activities and wealth began to be published in the Mexican press. He was described as the leader of an army of armed drug traffickers, whose force was estimated at 1,000 men, owner of 36 houses in Guadalajara and other properties in Zacatecas, Sinaloa, and Sonora, or a shareholder in 300 companies in Guadalajara. His fortune was estimated at 100 billion pesos. Rafa himself recounted that he began his career at the age of 28 as a drug trafficker, cultivating marijuana in small plots in Badiraguado, then moved to Guadalajara, and later moved his business to Chihuahua. He asked to be tried only as a drug trafficker, not a murderer. My first problem with the law happened when I was born. I always worked in the mountains where there was no law, Rafa would later recount. Caro Quintero's private life also became public knowledge. It was reported that he had kidnapped 17-year-old Sara Cosio, whom he had tried to court and had forcibly taken her to Costa Rica. He denied it was a kidnapping, assured that her parents knew about it, and that he had even given them cars. According to rumors, for this he was tortured and forced to retract his words about the Cosio family. On December 12, 1989, he was sentenced to 92 years in prison for the murder of Kiki Camarena and a series of other crimes, whose implication was proven thanks to Kiki's investigation. In 2013, due to procedural inconsistencies, he was released. A $20 million reward was immediately placed on his head. In 2016 and 2017, Rafa, on the run, would give 2 interviews to journalists, in which he would deny having any ties to the current Sinaloa cartel and the gang war, and say that he only wanted peace. For almost 9 years, during which he was free, Caro Quintero, however, appeared in his historical homeland and was involved in heated disputes for control of various territories in Sonora and Baja California against the group Los Chapitos, the sons of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. On July 15, 2022, he was epically recaptured and sent to Altiplano, from where the United States is currently seeking to extradite him to its territory. A few days later, in 1985, the government dealt another severe blow to Guadalajara's leadership structure. In Puerto Vallarta, at the home owned by Municipal Police Director Amaya Candelario Ramos, Don Neto was arrested. He declared that Rafa had kidnapped Camarena to reach an agreement with him, that he had seen the agent die as he had been beaten by Rafa and 2 of his assistants, and that he had become angry when he saw Camarena's lifeless body and slapped Rafa. Don Neto was sentenced to 40 years, and in 2016, for health reasons, he was released to house arrest. He is currently 93 years old. The cunning Mata Ballesteros remained in Honduras until 1988, a country that did not extradite criminals. But on April 5, 1988, he was illegally taken from his home and transported to the United States within 1 day. This sparked riots in his native country, and for a period, authorities even had to impose martial law. In the American judicial system, he went through all circles of hell. He was offered a deal to turn in the president of Panama, but he refused. The judges acknowledged that Mata had been illegally removed from his homeland, but said that this would not in the slightest affect the trial. Mata's case is now cited as a precedent that justifies the kidnapping of suspects from abroad. The charges against him were based on the testimonies of dubious witnesses who had plea bargained with the prosecution. He was imprisoned in the most horrific prison in the United States, and his case was used to threaten drug traffickers. "If you don't make a deal," the judges said, "you will end up like Mata Ballesteros." Perhaps the fact is also that he cooperated with the CIA, and in March 1988, the Contras and Sandinistas signed an armistice, which meant that the CIA's transport services and cocaine money were no longer needed. For this, he was liquidated. The CIA's trail is also found in the Kiki Camarena case, where not everything is so simple. There is a version that during the investigation, the DEA agent discovered what he should not have known. The CIA was sponsoring the Contras with cocaine money, and in Cabor, completely under Caro Quintero's control, there was a training camp, also sponsored by him, but with the full knowledge and unconditional protection of the CIA. In this sense, the DEA and the CIA were competing organizations, and their interests were opposed. In 2013, an investigation into the CIA trail in Kiki's murder was made public. 2 informants present at those events independently identified CIA agent Félix Rodriguez, also known as Gato Félix, Lázaro, Félix Ramos Medina, and Max Gomez. Most likely, the recording of Camarena's professional torture was made by him. He was a truly remarkable, almost cult figure. Rodriguez was involved in all CIA operations in South America, and in 1967, undercover as a Bolivian army major, he participated in the capture and interrogation of Che Guevara, and then it was he who gave the order to execute him. In the documentary The Last Narco, Don Neto's bodyguards, former DEA agents, Kiki's widow, and many, many others involved in this case provide testimonies that unite into a single picture. Rodriguez directly participated in Kiki's torture and asked questions related to Guadalajara's activity, the ultimate purpose of which was the financing of the Nicaraguan Contras. No Buffalo Ranch was involved. In reality, the order to eliminate Kiki came from his own superiors. Jack Lawn, former head of the DEA, and retired special agent Jack Taylor, who investigated the murder, stated that the CIA, of course, was not involved in Camarina's death. Lawn also declared that it was a fable, unworthy of the people who serve in the DEA. A CIA representative told the press, "It is ridiculous even to speculate that the CIA had anything to do with the murder of a U.S. federal agent or the escape of his killer." Be that as it may, the three main players of the Guadalajara Cartel ended up in custody. It turned out that to build their drug empire, it was not enough to buy everyone to escape persecution from the United States. Their visibility in the corruption zone worked in the Americans' favor. What initially allowed them to remain invisible now pushed them into the open. Mexican authorities ordered a cleanup of the ranks of the Federal Security Directorate to arrest and imprison all those members of the corporation who were linked to drug traffickers, smugglers, or other criminals. Press sources stated that these declarations provoked a wave of desertions among the institution's personnel, and on August 22nd, the federal police, in the form it was, ceased to exist. It was restructured. The Secretariat of National Defense, SEDENA, was also stripped of all operational powers in the fight against drug trafficking. Thus, Guadalajara was left without its best friends in the government. However, the aforementioned actions were not enough for U.S. authorities, who wanted to put behind bars everyone who, according to their own investigations, had participated in Camarina's murder. One of the bosses, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, remained at large, hiding in Mazatlan in the state of Sinaloa as a guest of Governor Antonio Toledo Coro. Furthermore, some details emerged about Gallardo's socially active life. He had, for example, his own bank in the state of Chihuahua. At least until 1982, his surname appeared in the documents. In January 1985, he opened, together with his partner and godson, an automotive business. Facts emerged about his work as a state judicial police officer in Sinaloa and as a bodyguard for Sanchez Celis, and so on. All this meant that Félix Gallardo was too integrated into the socio-political and economic structure of his homeland, where he was protected. And in Guadalajara, 4 years after Kiki Camarina's murder, when the protection provided by the federal police had disappeared, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo received the protection of the ruling party through his old acquaintance, Police Chief González Calderón. And everything indicated that the storm was abating. 2 years after Camarina's murder, Calderón assured Gallardo that the Americans had no significant evidence against him and that they would continue to support him. Their friendship continued, and according to Gallardo, they met at least 5 more times. Then, in 1988, Carlos Salinas became president of Mexico and began to conduct a kind of perestroika. Salinas immediately dealt not only with economic reforms, which would eventually lead Juárez and Tijuana to wars, but also with the reorganization of drug trafficking. When he took office, the undisputed godfather of Mexico was, of course, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. In April 1989, Gallardo went to a meeting with Calderón at a Guadalajara restaurant to discuss business. Or perhaps things didn't happen that way, because information about El Padrino's arrest varies depending on the source. One thing is certain, the order to arrest Miguel Ángel came from above. So, in fact, they told him, "We couldn't do anything about it. The order came from Mexico City." Gallardo himself states in his prison diaries that he was violently beaten at the time of his arrest and suffered several fractured ribs. But the humiliations did not end there. The new director of the anti-drug service, appointed by Salinas Coelho Trejo, met Gallardo at the Guadalajara airport and immediately began to threaten him. "We don't have anything on you yet, but we will tear you apart," he said, according to Gallardo. In the next 24 hours, he was tortured, trying to extract confessions about his involvement in Camarina's death, but he said nothing. Along with Gallardo, several important men from his entourage were arrested, including his accountant, who detailed all of El Padrino's movable and immovable assets. Everything was confiscated from his family, and he would even talk about the furniture in his mother's house in a 2022 interview. All valuables, he said, were illegally taken by Coelho Trejo, and nothing was ever returned to the Gallardo family. They were forced to live in a rented house, and his youngest son needed an expensive operation for which they now had no money. I don't know if El Padrino's stories are true, but the fact that the Mexican government could destroy the country's biggest gangster without a single gunshot is a very significant moment. In 1989, drug traffickers still counted on the police, on their connections, but Salinas' order and the arrest of the boss of bosses unexpectedly showed who was in charge. Thus, finally, the definitive break of the established and effective model of relations between the state and organized crime occurred. 4 years after Enrique Camarena's murder, under constant DEA pressure, Miguel Angel was still at large, indicating at that time a duality in the state's attitude. On one hand, a hunt for narcos was vigorously conducted by new structures. On the other hand, the state sought to re-establish the old friendship, so inconveniently interrupted by Camarena's murder, especially figures like Calderon. State against state. But Salinas' arrival and his reorientation towards the United States changed everything. A new era of cooperation with the White House began, and in this context, the capture of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was a powerful sign of the current government's strengthening in the face of criminal organizations and police authorities. It was a clear signal about who was in charge of the country, and at the same time, a positive nod to the United States government regarding its willingness to cooperate in the fight against drugs. At the same time, Gallardo's arrest triggered irreversible processes, as Valdez Castellón defined them: fragmentation and violence. After El Padrino's arrest, the capos held a gangster summit in the resort town of Acapulco. According to authoritative sources, it was not Miguel Ángel himself who gathered the bosses, as in the series, predicting the empire's fall, but they met to decide what to do. El Padrino himself states in his prison diaries that the meeting was organized by Calderon. It is possible that both versions are true, because Calderon was then sure of Gallardo's upcoming release. The old friends from Sinaloa gathered in a luxurious beachfront chalet. How would they conduct business? They were all interconnected as relatives, as friends, as neighbors, as old business partners who had completed so many deals. All would play a crucial role in shaping drug trafficking over the next 2 decades. Each capo was then assigned an area where he could transport his own drugs and tax any other smuggler in his territory. Ciudad Juárez for Chapo Guzmán, and also Ciudad Juárez and Nuevo Laredo for Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, a former federal police agent. San Luis Río Colorado for Luis Héctor El Güero, Palma Salazar, Nogales and Hermosillo for Emilio Caro Quintero, Rafa's uncle, Tijuana for Jesus Don Chuya Labra, and his nephews, the Arellano Félix brothers, Sinaloa for Ismael El Mayo Zambada, Mexico for Rafael Chávez, another former federal agent. Furthermore, Manuel Beltrán, Félix Huberto Campas, and Javier Caro Payan, Rafa's brother, could move freely in all areas without creating problems and serving only as intermediaries. All of this sounded like a good idea, but without the leadership of the incarcerated godfather Félix Gallardo, the capos began vying for a larger share of the pie. As the renowned researcher Blanche Cornell wrote, "Never in the history of Mexican drug trafficking was there more of a man like Félix Gallardo. He was a man of his word, prioritizing agreements over gunshots, persuasive arguments over executions. If the bosses had followed his instructions, the most powerful cartel in the world would now exist." But the absence of a leader and the presence of several bosses, each of whom felt superior to the other, caused disorganization. In this confusion, shortly thereafter, 3 cartels rose to power: Tijuana, with the Arellano Félix brothers, Juárez with Amado Carrillo Fuentes, and Gulf with Nepomuceno Guerra. All were Sinaloans and operated within the Sinaloan Empire, contributing to shipments and sharing contacts of corrupt police officers. It is extremely important to understand the ties within this Sinaloan kingdom to grasp the significance of the current Mexican drug war. Even DEA agents confirmed cooperation among all drug traffickers in northwestern Mexico. In a secret operational intelligence report already in the 1990s, the following observations were made about this system. The cartel schema is widely disseminated, but it distorts the true power and strength of Mexican drug traffickers. Recent examples of individuals able to overcome these cartel boundaries include Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who collaborated with both El Chapo in Sonora and El Mayo in Tijuana. Although the Sinaloan clan continued to work together, there was restlessness. The biggest clash in the early 1990s erupted between the Arellano Félix brothers and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman over supplies in California. The war was not as brutal as in the 21st century, when almost professional units fight, but hitmen clashed in a series of shootouts and murders, leaving dozens of bodies. Looking back, one can discern the early signs that the Mexican government would prove incapable of containing the beast El Narco, that the bloodshed would spiral out of control. As professional historians say, it is always dangerous to read history backward. At the time, no one in the Mexican government seemed to care. There is violence, but it's drug traffickers killing drug traffickers, politicians sighed. In any case, drug traffickers did not attack the system, but rather competed among themselves to see who would be the best. The government could simply observe the carnage and collect money, whoever came out victorious. Thus, the 1980s were, without a doubt, a decisive decade for the formation of organized crime in Mexico, dedicated to illicit drug trafficking. First, the impact of the American drug market on the Mexican market was varied. Demand for marijuana and heroin declined, and Operation Condor even led the Colombians to leadership in the weed market. On the other hand, this very operation catalyzed the expansion of marijuana plantations in Mexican territories and also formed a corridor for cocaine transport between Mexico and Colombia. Second, it was the golden decade for the Sinaloa organization under the leadership of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero, as well as with the support of family clans such as Guzman, Zambada, Arellano Félix, Carrillo Fuentes, Beltrán Leiva, Lupercio, and alliances with political and regional leaders. The Guadalajara Cartel consolidated its power over the entire western territory of the country from Oaxaca to Baja California, along the entire Pacific coast, and also in Durango and Chihuahua. Only a few organizations competed with them, for example, Pablo Acosta's organization in Ojinaga. But when the Sinaloan guarantor Amado Carrillo Fuentes arrived to resolve cocaine-related issues, he ceased to be a competitor. Third, the model of coexistence between the state and drug traffickers, who jointly regulated drug trafficking, had exhausted itself in the 1980s and over time revealed fatal consequences: the expansion and strengthening of organized crime and the transformation of police forces into criminals, and, consequently, the weakening of the state and the defenselessness of citizens. Fourth, the arrest of the main leaders of the Sinaloa organization, Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, led to the fragmentation of the Mexican drug market and the emergence of new organizations. In short, from the quasi-monopoly of Sinaloa, the Mexican market transitioned to open competition and inevitably to a war among all for the largest share of the pie. The 1990s were coming: new drugs, new players, and new rules.